My daughter-in-law called me a stubborn old fool for a week straight. Then the night she left town, my blind grandson pulled a hidden ledger out of the wall and told me it was time to make her pay. Before I go any further, hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and let's get into this. My name is Walter Griggs. I'm 64 years old, and what I'm about to tell you cost me almost everything I had left in this world before it gave me back my family. It was a Thursday evening in late September when the whole nightmare cracked wide open. I was sitting on the back porch of my house outside Tulsa, working a crossword puzzle under the yellow bug light, listening to my daughter-in-law's car finally pull out of the driveway for her big work conference in Dallas. 4 days, she'd said. 4 days of peace, I remember thinking, though I felt guilty even thinking it. I set down my pencil and rubbed at the arthritis, knuckling up in my right hand. 42 years running a print shop downtown will do that to you. 42 years of setting type and hauling paper stock and fixing jammed presses with my bare fingers. I know how to find what's broken in a machine. I know how to feel out the one part that's failing before the whole system grinds to a stop. But the one thing in my life I couldn't fix, the one thing that had been broken for 3 years, was my grandson. Eli is 11 years old. He used to climb every tree on our street, used to read me the backs of cereal boxes just because he loved the sound of his own voice discovering new words. Then came the fever. 3 years ago, encephalitis nearly took him from us in a single terrifying week, and when it finally let go, it left him, or so we were told, completely blind. The specialists said the optic nerve damage was total and irreversible. My son Daniel had died 2 years before that, killed by a drunk driver on the interstate. So it was just me and Eli's mother, Renata, raising him together. I moved into the little guest house behind their place to help out. Renata always said she just couldn't manage a blind child alone on top of her demanding job at the insurance firm, and so I became the one who walked Eli to his special classes, who read him his books at night, who learned every color of the rainbow through his fingers pressed against fabric samples. For 3 years, my retirement had been built entirely around guiding a boy through a world he supposedly could no longer see. Renata handled everything else, his medications, his supplement drops, his specialist appointments, every dollar of the settlement money that came in after Daniel's accident. She held complete control of it all, and I never once thought to question her. With Renata gone for 4 days, the guest house and the main house both went quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. I planned to let Eli sleep in, then take him fishing down at the pond behind the property. Just the two of us. No rigid schedule, no hovering stepmother figure watching the clock. I was halfway through 14 across when I heard it. Not the careful tap-tap-tap of Eli's white cane finding its way down the hallway. A hard scrape. A thud against the drywall. Then a small, sharp gasp, like someone catching their own breath in surprise. My gut went cold immediately. I set the crossword down on the porch railing and reached for the flashlight I kept by the door. Old habits from working a shop in a rough part of downtown for 4 decades, and I moved through the house toward Eli's room, expecting to find him fallen, hurt, tangled in something. What I found instead stopped my heart cold in my chest. Eli was standing at the built-in bookshelf in the hallway, and he was not swinging his cane in front of him searching for obstacles. He was looking. His eyes were tracking directly along the spines of the books, scanning left to right with total precision, the way any sighted child would read a shelf. He had one small hand pressed flat against a section of the drywall near the baseboard, and with the other he was working a section of paneling loose, sliding it sideways like he'd done it 100 times before. My flashlight beam hit him and he spun around, and for one impossible second, his eyes locked directly onto mine and followed the light. He flinched away from the brightness exactly like a boy who could see it. "Eli," I choked out, the word barely making it past my throat. "Eli, look at me." He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, breathing hard, staring at me with eyes that were absolutely, unmistakably seeing me. Then something in his face crumpled, and instead of joy, instead of the miracle I desperately wanted to believe I was watching, I saw pure terror. He looked at me the way you'd look at someone you weren't sure you could trust. "Grandpa," he whispered, "you can't tell her. You cannot tell her you saw this." I dropped to my knees in front of him, my hands shaking as I gripped his shoulders. "Eli, son, what in God's name is going on?" The doctors said what she paid them to say," he said, and his voice cracked with something far too old for an 11-year-old boy. Hit like and subscribe if you're as stunned as I was right now. And tell me below where in the world you're tuning in from tonight, because what my grandson told me next turned my whole understanding of the last 3 years completely upside down. I sat down right there on the hallway floor, pulling him into my lap like he was 6 years old again, and he told me. He told me that 6 months ago, during a routine follow-up, a locum doctor filling in for our regular specialist had done a simple pupil response test and looked confused by what he saw. Renata had rushed Eli out of that appointment so fast she nearly left her purse behind. That night, alone in his room, Eli said something in him just knew. Some instinct clicked into place, and he started testing himself in secret. He'd stare at the closed blinds when moonlight came through the slats. He'd watch shadows crawl across his ceiling. Slowly, cautiously, terrified of what it might mean, he realized his vision was returning, or maybe it had never fully left at all. But he kept pretending. Every single day for 6 months, he pretended. He memorized the layout of every room by feel so he'd never look too confident walking through the house. He let his mother guide his hand to sign forms. He drank the daily eye drops she insisted on administering herself each morning, holding them under his tongue when he could, spitting them into his pillowcase when she wasn't looking, because something about the way she guarded that little brown bottle, something about how she wouldn't let the home health aide handle it, made him afraid. "Why were you looking behind the wall just now?" I asked him, my chest still hammering. Eli pulled back from me, and the fear in his face hardened into something else, a kind of cold, focused resolve I'd never seen in a child before. "Because 3 nights ago I heard her on the phone in the kitchen," he said. "She was talking to somebody about Dad's trust fund running out early. She said something about the policy paperwork, and she said, once the underwriters sign off, it won't matter what anybody suspects. And then she said, he still thinks he's blind. That's the whole beauty of it." The words hit me like a fist to the sternum. I asked him what was behind the wall, and he showed me a shallow cavity between the studs, hidden by a panel he'd discovered was loose months ago, while running his hands along the baseboards, back when everyone still believed his hands were his only way of understanding the world. Inside was a slim, fireproof document box. He'd found it weeks earlier, memorized the combination by watching Renata's fingers through a cracked bedroom door one night while she thought he was asleep on the couch, and finally worked up the courage to open it while she was away. We carried that box out to the kitchen table together. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the little latch. Inside were folded insurance documents, bank statements from an account I'd never heard of, and a slim manila folder labeled simply Danielle Final. I opened it and felt the floor tilt beneath me. My son's death, the drunk driving accident that had taken him from us 2 years ago, had come with a $2 million life insurance payout. Renata had told the whole family the money was locked in an irrevocable trust for Eli's future care, untouchable, protected. But the documents in that box told a different story. There was no trust. There was a series of wire transfers to an account under a name I didn't recognize, a woman's name, and beneath that, buried at the bottom of the folder, a photocopied newspaper clipping from a small town in Missouri, dated 9 years earlier. It was an obituary. A man named Gerald Voss, survived by his wife Renata Voss, dead of what the article called an accidental fall. Only 14 months into their marriage, with a life insurance settlement mentioned in passing near the bottom. I stared at the maiden name on that clipping and then at the woman my son had married, and the room went ice cold around me. "Grandpa," Eli whispered, staring at the same clipping over my shoulder. Was Dad's accident really an accident? I didn't have an answer for him. I only had a growing, suffocating certainty that the woman who had raised my grandson for 3 years, who had convinced an entire family and apparently an entire county of doctors that a healthy boy was blind, had done something like this before. And if she'd done it before, there was no reason on this green earth to believe she was finished. I wanted, more than anything, to march straight down to the Tulsa Police Department with that fireproof box under my arm. Every fatherly, grandfatherly instinct in my body screamed at me to do exactly that. But I made myself stop and think it through the way I used to think, through a jammed printing press, trace the mechanism, find where the real failure point was, don't just start pulling parts loose. Renata held full legal guardianship of Eli. She held medical power of attorney. If I walked into a precinct with a wild story about faked blindness and a decade-old obituary, she would come home from Dallas, put on her tears, and paint me as a bitter old man trying to seize custody of his dead son's child out of grief and control. She had 3 years of doctor's notes, therapy records, and a flawless public reputation as a devoted single mother. I had a locked box, and a boy nobody but me would believe. I told Eli we needed proof nobody could argue with. Real proof, caught in the act. Something no lawyer on earth could spin into a grieving widow's misunderstanding. That night, after Eli was finally, exhaustedly asleep, I drove to the 24-hour hardware store off Highway 75 and bought everything I needed with cash. 42 years running a print shop means you learn a little bit of everything. Wiring, small engines, basic electronics, because you fix your own machines when the repairman quotes you 3 weeks out. I'd also spent a summer years back helping my brother-in-law install home security systems to pick up extra cash, and those skills came rushing back to me now with startling clarity. I bought 2 compact wireless cameras disguised as smoke detectors, a voice-activated audio recorder small enough to tuck behind a picture frame, and a roll of black electrical tape. I mounted the first camera in the kitchen, angled toward the counter where I'd seen, now that I was truly looking, a small locked cabinet Renata always kept the key to on her own key ring. I mounted the second in the living room, aimed at the recliner where Eli did his reading lessons with his large print Braille-adjacent workbooks, lessons Renata insisted on supervising personally, rather than letting the specialist tutor handle alone. I tucked the audio recorder behind a framed photograph of Daniel on the bookshelf in the front hallway, the same hallway where I'd first caught Eli seeing. I told Eli, over breakfast the next morning, that we had one job now. Act completely normal until she came home, and let him keep pretending too, just a little longer. He looked at me with those eyes that could see everything now, eyes still sharp with fear, and he nodded. Renata came home from her Dallas conference on Sunday evening, 2 days earlier than she'd originally told us, sweeping through the front door with her rolling suitcase and a story about the conference wrapping early. She hugged Eli, guided his hand along the wall the way she always did to help her blind boy navigate, and I watched her do it now with completely different eyes. It wasn't affection, it was choreography. It was a woman rehearsing the role she'd built her entire life around, and doing it flawlessly, because she'd apparently done it before. For 3 days I lived inside that house like a man walking on the thinnest possible ice, watching the hidden camera footage upload each night to the cloud storage account I'd set up on my phone, praying I'd catch something before she caught us. On the 3rd night, I watched the footage from the living room camera and felt my blood turn to ice water. Renata sat across from Eli during his supposed reading lesson, and in a voice too low for normal hearing but perfectly clear on my audio recorder, she said, "I've already spoken to Marcus about the second policy. Once the guardianship review clears next month and they confirm his condition is permanent, we're finally free to move forward with everything. No more waiting, baby. Mommy's tired of waiting. Marcus, a second policy." My hands went numb holding the phone. I scrubbed back through days of audio and found more a phone call to a man named Marcus Feld, a name I didn't recognize, discussing a juvenile disability rider on a policy that would pay out substantially more if Eli's blindness was certified as permanent and irreversible by a specific physician before his 12th birthday, which was less than 6 weeks away. And buried in that same conversation, a sentence that made me physically sick. The Voss policy taught me patience pays out bigger. This one's worth almost 4 times what Gerald's was. I understood then, with total clarity, that Renata wasn't planning to harm Eli directly. Her plan was colder and slower than that. She was going to keep him certified blind, keep collecting an enhanced disability payout that grew every year. He remained impaired, possibly for the rest of his life, all while quietly building whatever came after whatever had happened to Gerald Voss, whatever might eventually happen to a boy who'd outlived his usefulness once he turned 18, and the payments changed structure. I called the number for the Tulsa Police Department's Financial Crimes Division the next morning, but something in the back of my mind, that old machinist's instinct, told me a local desk sergeant wasn't going to move fast enough on a story this complicated, involving insurance fraud across 2 states and a possible decade-old homicide. Instead, I found the number for the FBI field office and asked to speak to someone in white-collar crime, and I told the receptionist 3 words that got a call back within the hour: insurance fraud, homicide. The agent who returned my call, a calm, measured man named Agent Priya Anand, no, Special Agent Daniel Ruiz, And I remember thinking it was strange hearing my late son's name spoken by a stranger, listen to every detail, without interrupting once. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. And then he told me something that nearly knocked me out of my chair. The Bureau had an open file, nearly 2 years cold, on the death of a man named Gerald Voss in Missouri, and separately, a newer file flagging suspicious patterns in juvenile disability insurance claims across 3 states, filed under an internal code name because they suspected, but couldn't prove a single individual was responsible. They had never been able to connect the 2 cases to a living suspect. I had just handed them the thread that tied the whole thing together. Agent Ruiz told me what I already feared he'd say. It wasn't enough yet. To make federal fraud and potentially homicide charges stick against a woman with 3 years of flawless medical documentation behind her, they needed her caught in the unmistakable act of directing or falsifying Eli's medical status, ideally on the record, ideally with him present. They needed to catch her at the exact appointment where she planned to have his permanent blindness certified before his birthday. That appointment, according to the audio recording, was scheduled for the following Tuesday, with a specialist named Dr. Holt Weaver, a name Agent Ruiz recognized instantly and grimly, a physician already under a separate, unrelated ethics review for irregular disability certifications. The days leading up to that Tuesday were the longest of my life. I had to sit across the dinner table from the woman who had likely killed my son's predecessor and was systematically defrauding an insurance company using my grandson's supposed disability, and I had to smile and pass the potatoes and ask about her day. Eli had to keep tapping his cane down hallways he could see perfectly well, keep letting her guide his hand, keep swallowing eye drops under his tongue and spitting them out later. 6 months of practiced deception now stretched to its absolute breaking point. Some nights I heard him crying quietly in his room, and I'd sit outside his door with my hand flat against the wood, not going in, because Agent Ruiz had warned me that any sudden emotional shift in the household could tip Renata off that something was wrong. Tuesday morning arrived gray and overcast. Agent Ruiz and his team had arranged for 2 federal agents to pose as visiting specialists, observing Dr. Weaver's practice that day, standard enough that Renata wouldn't blink twice. I drove Eli and Renata to the appointment myself, my hand so tight on the steering wheel my knuckles ached exactly the way they used to after a long shift at the press. In the waiting room, Eli sat beside me with his cane resting against his knee, staring straight ahead at nothing, playing his role one final time, and I reached over and squeezed his hand once, hard, the only comfort I dared offer. Dr. Weaver's exam room had thin walls and a hidden recording device the size of a shirt button clipped inside Agent Ruiz's jacket. I sat in the waiting room, listening through an earpiece the agents had given me that morning, technically not supposed to be wearing it, but Ruiz had quietly slipped it to me anyway, understanding a father's need to hear. I listened as Dr. Weaver began the standard exam, then paused, and in a low voice asked Renata whether the arrangement from their last conversation still stood. I heard Renata's voice, smooth and warm as honey, confirm that it did, and mention a figure, an additional payment on top of his usual consulting fee for signing off on permanent irreversible optic damage, without running the updated imaging that would have shown Eli's nerve function had substantially recovered months ago. That was the moment. That was the unmistakable, undeniable act Agent Ruiz needed. The door to the exam room burst open, and 4 federal agents who had been posing as staff and waiting patients throughout the building converged at once. I heard Dr. Weaver's chair scrape back violently, heard him start babbling immediately about how it was all her idea, heard Renata's voice shift in a single heartbeat, from honeyed warmth to something flat and reptilian and cold as I'd ever heard a human voice become. I ran into that exam room the second Agent Ruiz waved me forward, and I saw my grandson standing beside the exam table, on his own 2 feet, looking directly at his mother with eyes that saw her completely and clearly for the very first time in the open. Renata's face, when she realized Eli was looking straight at her, unguarded, unblinking, no longer pretending, cracked wide open into something monstrous. She lunged toward him not to embrace him, but with her hand already curling into a fist, and an agent caught her arm mid-motion and forced it behind her back. "You ungrateful little," she started, and then stopped herself, because 4 federal agents and a recording device had just heard exactly what kind of woman she really was. They found the rest over the following weeks, and it was worse than any of us could have imagined sitting in that gray waiting room. Renata Voss Griggs, it turned out, was not her first identity either. Under her true name, she had cycled through 3 separate marriages and guardianships across 4 states over the past 11 years, always targeting men or families with a vulnerable dependent and a substantial insurance payout attached. Gerald Voss's fatal fall, a stepdaughter in Nebraska whose chronic seizure disorder mysteriously resolved the week her disability benefits were finally denied, and now my son's death and my grandson's manufactured blindness. Investigators believe Daniel's fatal accident, initially ruled a simple case of a drunk driver running a red light, may not have been the random tragedy we all grieved. The other driver, it turned out, had received an unexplained cash deposit 2 days before the crash, and though the full truth of that thread is still being pulled apart by federal prosecutors even now, the possibility alone was enough to make me physically sick for months. Dr. Weaver flipped almost immediately, trading testimony against Renata for a lighter sentence, and his cooperation blew the case wide open, revealing 2 other complicit physicians in 2 other states who had certified false disabilities for a fee across nearly a decade. The trial, when it finally came 8 months later, was swift and merciless. The evidence, the audio, the exam room recording, the decade of financial trails the forensic accountants unraveled left no room for her expensive attorneys to maneuver. Renata was convicted on multiple counts of insurance fraud, financial exploitation of a minor, and, after prosecutors successfully connected new forensic evidence to the crash that killed my son, second-degree murder, she was sentenced to life without parole. The months after that were not some instant fairy tale healing. Eli had spent 3 years training his own eyes to look away, training his hands to memorize what his eyes could already tell him, and unlearning that fear took real time and real work with a trauma specialist who understood exactly what he'd survived. There were nights he woke up, still reaching out to touch the walls of a dark room out of pure habit, before remembering he didn't need to anymore. There were nights he asked me quietly whether his father had really loved him, or whether that too had all been some kind of performance, and I held him and told him the truth, that a father's love, real love, doesn't come with hidden conditions or secret ledgers behind the drywall. It just shows up every single day, whether anyone's watching or not. We recovered what we could of Daniel's stolen legacy, too. Federal prosecutors clawed back a substantial portion of the fraudulent insurance payouts and placed them into a properly supervised trust this time, one with actual oversight, actual accountability, meant to carry Eli all the way through college and beyond. It's been almost a year now since that gray Tuesday morning. Eli plays shortstop for his middle school baseball team these days, and I sit in the bleachers every single game, watching him track a fly ball across open sky with eyes that have never needed to hide from the sun again. Last week, he looked up into the stands between innings, found my face in the crowd without even searching, the way any boy naturally finds his grandfather, and gave me a grin so wide and unguarded it nearly broke my heart all over again, this time in the best possible way. A grandfather's job doesn't end when his own son is gone. If anything, it becomes the last promise left standing. I would walk through that same nightmare 100 times over, if it meant getting my grandson back into the daylight. The most dangerous people in our lives rarely look dangerous at all. They look like the ones who tuck your children in at night, who hold the medicine bottle, who cry the loudest at the funeral. Trust your gut when something feels wrong, even inside your own house, even from someone wearing a wedding ring and a widow's grief. And when you finally see the truth clearly, don't come at it with your emotions first. Come at it with proof nobody can argue with. Have you ever discovered that someone closest to you was never who they claimed to be? Tell me your story in the comments below, and let me know where in the country you're listening from tonight. If this story moved you even half as much as living through it moved me, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who still believes family means safety, because it should. It always should. Sometimes the people who love us loudest are just performing, and the ones who truly love us show it in the quiet, steady things: a hand on a doorknob, a promise kept without an audience. Eli didn't get his sight back from a miracle. He got his family back by trusting the one person who never stopped showing up. Look closely at who stays when nothing's being watched. That's where the real love lives. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson still found its way into your heart.